Learn everything possible about your topic. What are the relevant policies in the general plan, the zoning regulations and subdivision regulations, um, any other regulations that might apply. Find out the process and the timing for key decisions, and when are the most advantageous and strategic ways to influence those decisions. Could we have the next slide? So clout definitely counts. Environmentalists and community groups don't have the same power as moneyed interests. They don't make big donations to elected officials, and they don't have enormous amounts of money to spend on a campaign. But you can often overcome this inherent disadvantage. What allies do you have, and how can you engage and empower more allies through networking? Reach out to communities of color and groups who may not have traditional allies. Empower others to use the knowledge about both the topic and the process. Knowledgeable allies can increase your clout tremendously. Next slide, please. What motivates, and another important thing to find out is, if you can, what motivates key decision makers? Find out what's important to them and how does your issue fit into all the other concerns that they have to deal with. And use this information in crafting your arguments. That's a picture of Pete McCloskey, our esteemed former congressman, war hero, and he was one of the founders of Earth Day, and also he's been honored by the Sierra Club, I believe. Jackie Spear and Anna Eshoo also. Next slide. Next slide. Susan, get another, okay. In addition to finding out what motivates the decision makers, it's really helpful if you can develop relationships with key people, including aides to those decision makers, public agency staff people, and important interest groups who may not be natural allies, such as labor sometimes. It may sound weird given the past 5 years, but in the long run, everything in life depends upon good relationships. Building trust and relationships with others can give you a huge advantage. Next slide. Maintain credibility. This is another weird thing to say after the past 5 years. Never lie or mislead anyone. If you inadvertently have used the wrong information, admit your error. Nothing will undermine your credibility more quickly than a lie. In this category, I include letting others that you are working with know when you have some kind of major disagreement, and if necessary, you need to agree to disagree. Next slide. This is kind of similar. Don't attack other people personally. Even with the most vexatious provocateurs, you can and you should strongly argue against ideas, but don't publicly attack the speaker or the source of those ideas, whether it's an individual or a group. When I'm attacked, and that does happen, I always consider the source. The problem is nearly always with that person, and there is nothing I can do about it. Yes, it's often painful, but let it go. And remember that the more attention you call to an opponent's arguments, the more power you yield to him or her. The slide that we're looking at now is the 8th tip: don't burn bridges. You'd be amazed at how many opponents on one issue become allies on another. Civility seems to have nearly disappeared in large sections of our society today, but letting the other side know, be respectful, by respectful acknowledgement, if possible, that you understand their point of view, it can all pay off in the long run. A good example is on San Bruno Mountain, where environmentalists and developers were at loggerheads for decades, but became allies when PG&E proposed to install new gas transmission lines across protected habitat on the side of the mountain. PG&E eventually had to give up their effort, and they located those new lines under the streets instead. And if environmentalists and developers hadn't been banded together, I think PG&E would have gotten their way. So it really helps to keep those possible relationships in the future out there. And the next slide. Remember that results are what counts, not your personal glory. Work with everyone and anyone you can, and let others bask in the spotlight wherever possible. If you become too ego-driven, the system has a way of knocking you down to size. Always thank those who deserve it. And it doesn't hurt to spread some thanks around, even to some of those who don't deserve it. You can't thank others enough. And finally, number 10 is maintain your sense of humor and have fun. Okay, there we are. Take time to smell the flowers. Go to the beach. If something is overwhelming, take a break. Go for a hike or seek out a quiet place and soak in the beauty and diversity of nature. As John Muir said famously, climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Nature's peace will flow into you like sunshine flows into trees. The restorative power of nature is enormous. Today, it's stunningly clear that we face unprecedented challenges. I was much more optimistic about the future of the planet 20 years ago when I first wrote these tips for environmental advocates. With climate change accelerating and intensifying, our droughts, our fires, floods, and other disasters, we must redouble our efforts to reduce greenhouse gases and plan for getting people out of the way of these inexorable natural forces. But I'm still hopeful. More than ever, it's going to take concerted action by all of us, and the clock is ticking. So you are part of the solution, and thank you so much for helping with that. As a last slide, I'd like to close with a quote from Jane Goodall. We can have the last slide. Okay, you cannot get through a single day without having an impact on the world around you. What you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make. So thank you again for including me in this program. At the bottom here, the final slide, I have just information as to how to contact me. I'm honored to be part of this effort, and feel free to contact me. You can, my email is there, and also if you want to see the 10 tips again, they're now on Green Foothills website, which is www.greenfoothills.org. Thanks very much. And I don't know if there's time for questions, but you could certainly just send me an email and I'll be glad to answer them.
Thank you, Lenny. Thank you for your inspiring talk. It's a good start to our class. The speaker, we do have a video to watch. The speaker, oh, there is a question. Sorry, Steve. I didn't see it in the chat, but go ahead, Steve. Nina.
Oh, actually, I gave him the clap.
That you were clapping. I see it. It's a moving hand. I get it.
Yeah.
I see that now. So we are going to go ahead and take a look at a video that we showed in our May 2021 webinar. The speaker in the video is John Bourgeois, who has a long history with our Bay, and he'll introduce the idea of nature-based adaptation to sea level rise, a topic that we're going to return to in later classes.
To that point, I'm honored to introduce our first presenter, John Bourgeois, Deputy Operating Officer at the Watershed Stewardship and Planning at Valley Water.
Good morning. Thank you, James, for that introduction. Yeah, I'd like to second the great panel that you guys have pulled together in this webinar series, and I'm honored to be a part of it and to be able to kick it off. I titled my talk, Welcome to San Francisco Bay. As my last name may have given you a little clue, I'm originally from South Louisiana, got Cajun blood, and did my graduate work and early career there. And as you can imagine, there are quite a few wetland issues in South Louisiana. But I've been living and working in San Francisco Bay for the past 23 plus years. And I know we all live and work in the area, but I want to give you kind of a tour of San Francisco Bay from my perspective as a restoration practitioner. I currently work with Valley Water. I've worn a number of hats around San Francisco Bay, including serving over 9 years as the executive project manager for the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. And so I typically like to start my presentations with this image. So this is a photograph taken around the turn of the last century, and scrawled across the back was a good day's bag. And you can see the number of ducks strung around this hunter's neck. This was in the South Bay. And I'd like to start off with this to kind of humanize the experience that people had with San Francisco Bay. There are multiple written accounts of what the bay was like back then. And they say that when the birds would take off from the bay, the sky would blacken. This was an incredible resource. And it's because there was a vast amount of tidal wetlands present in San Francisco Bay. This is some great historical ecology work done by SFEI showing the historic extent of what these marshlands used to be. But more than just the marshlands, the bay itself used to be more a part of our everyday lives here, right? The bay, we are the Bay Area. The bay is why we're here. It was a big part of commerce and trade and recreation and sustenance. It really was a part of people's everyday lives here. And we've kind of gotten away from that over time. And as a result, we've ended up mistreating our bay through the years. We've lost 85 to 90% of those tidal wetlands. We've drained the wetlands for agriculture. We've flooded them for salt production. We've filled them for development. And we had quite a bit of loss. We also treated it as a dumping ground, not just filling for development, but also this is where we put our garbage. This is where we pumped our raw sewage, and really transformed the way we interact with the bay to the point where it wasn't so much, it was kind of an out of sight, out of mind. We built bridges around it, roads, bridges over it, roads around it. It became less and less a part of our collective psyche. And there were even some very radical plans proposed to just completely dam it off. And all of this, as all of this was happening, it sparked an environmental movement. These three women in Berkeley who founded Save the Bay saw what was going on and really understood the value of the bay. And one of the big lessons that I think they had to convey to people was helping them understand why the bay is important. So I feel like we still are having that conversation today. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about why we should care about San Francisco Bay. The obvious answer is the habitat answer, right? As a restoration ecologist, I get that a lot. People think that large-scale wetland restoration is something that, is a luxury. It's a nice to have. It's not a must-have. When times are good, we can allocate some resources for fish and wildlife habitat and recreation, et cetera. But it's much more than that. And you'll see, hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll understand that it is much more than that. But there are significant environmental reasons to do these large-scale wetland restorations. We've got endangered species that are endemic to San Francisco Bay, but also the San Francisco Bay Delta, that system is the largest estuary on the West Coast, not of the United States, but of the entire North and South America. So it has been deemed an estuary of hemispheric importance. And if you're ever out there on the bay during the migration season, you'll get a flavor, a taste of what it's like and how rich and abundant the wildlife is out there. And it's also surrounded by 7.5 million people, right? I think during the pandemic, it's really highlighted how important our outdoor open spaces are to our mental health and part of our society here. And so having that as a resource for the human inhabitants of the bay is important as well. But like I said, wetlands provide more than just fish and wildlife habitat. As I mentioned earlier, we haven't always treated our bay well as far as water quality, dumping our garbage and our sewage and chemicals, et cetera, into the bay. And so there's an extensive tracking process. This is from the State of the Estuary report, looking at the ecological health. And wetlands are a big component of being able to help restore ecological health and filter out contaminants. So this is a really a great benefit of having large-scale wetlands in the system. They really can help improve water quality. So if you care about water quality, you should also care about wetlands. And finally, if none of that really resonates with you, I hope this will, because we really have an opportunity here in front of us. And the wetlands can be part of a flood protection strategy. They allow for flood storage as well as shoreline protection. We live in a very complex mosaic at the edge of the bay. We have habitats, we have flood risk intermingled with commerce and industry and infrastructure and people's homes. And it really is a complex interface. And as we go through these past few years, we've witnessed on television these, horrific flooding events that are happening with these storms all over the country. But we have a pretty short memory because there are areas right here that are at risk and have significant history of flooding. And so this is not an abstract thing that can happen elsewhere. This has been happening for us, and we need to be prepared for it. And it's not just low-lying communities. It's also a lot of our tech industry. The heart of our economy has been built up in areas along the edge of the bay that are either at risk now or are going to be at risk in future sea level rise scenarios. So there is a big, strong economic driver to make sure that we protect all of the resources. This is an image that showed up in the front of the New York Times after Hurricane Sandy. It was one of these possible solutions, like how do we protect Manhattan from this big storm surge? And wetlands were part of the conversation then. And I think this is a great highlight of the benefit of wetlands in attenuating some flood risk. But I have to say, San Francisco Bay is in a much better position where we actually have the space to accommodate large-scale wetland restoration. And a lot of that is happening right now. So we have an unprecedented opportunity in front of us. And one point I really want to drive home is that with sea level rise, marshes can actually grow. They are in a dynamic equilibrium with the bay. If there is enough sediment supply in the bay, marshes can keep pace. They can grow in elevation and expand to accommodate changes in sea level rise. So that's a nice adaptation of these marshes that we need to keep into consideration. And what does that mean for flood protection? Well, on the left is a conceptual model showing, if you have extensive marsh areas in front of your flood protection systems, they help attenuate the waves and absorb some of that energy. And you can actually have a little bit lower levy, and you actually dramatically reduce your O&M costs to operate and maintain. The pictures on the right are from San Francisco Bay. You can see levee systems where you have marshes in front of them and where you don't. And you can see the rock and the erosion on that face when you don't have marshes in front of you. And so it really drives up your operations and maintenance costs. And this is the concept that you may have heard called the horizontal levee, right? This is a gradual slope into this zone of habitat placed on the bay side of your flood protection levee, or conversely, moving your levee to a place to accommodate this transition zone. Right? This has also been called an ecotone or a upland transition zones or a horizontal levee. And I'm happy to report that there are a lot of large-scale wetland restorations happening around the bay right now. So we're seeing a lot of progress. We really are in a renaissance, moving away from trying to conserve every square foot of precious habitat to now really broadening out and doing some large-scale wetland restoration and making changes at a landscape scale. But we are not without our challenges. And it was mentioned already, but sea level rise is a big one. To get these marshes, they can keep pace with sea level rise, but we need to give them as much of a head start as possible and get them established. And there's another side of the coin here. I mentioned it. For those marshes to be able to keep pace with sea level rise, we need to have enough suspended sediment in the system, right? So that those marshes can grow as the seas rise. And so we're potentially facing this double whammy of decreased sediment supply and increasing sea level rise. So this is something that we really need to take into account, because it's not just about restoring a certain place in time. It's not about a single marsh. It's about restoring all of the processes that are in place. We need to look upland, we need to look out into the bay and make sure we are restoring complete systems and that the processes are in place so that we can ensure sustainable habitat and so that we can reap those benefits over time. Now, San Francisco Bay has long been known as a place of innovation. And I think this also applies to what we're seeing on the sea level rise front. There have been any number of planning documents going back decades of people already starting to think about these situations. And in particular, I want to call your attention to the 1999 Balance Ecosystem Habitat Goals Report. This was kind of a groundbreaking regional planning effort where if you were doing a project in your corner of the bay, you could go to this report, find out what the priorities are, and the goal would be that all of these projects could then add up to something greater at a bay level scale. But 1999 was a long time ago. We have since updated that report. By we, I mean collectively the community in San Francisco Bay. With the 2015 Balance Ecosystem Habitat Goals Science Update, which specifically was put in place to address climate change, which was not, it was mentioned in the 1999 report, but not, our understanding of it has dramatically changed. And if you take nothing else from my talk, I really want you to take home these 3 points. These are kind of the major take-home points of that update to the Balance Ecosystem Goals Report. And this is where kind of the innovative and progressive thinking of the area comes in. First, we need to restore complete systems. We need to restore the processes that are in place so that these habitats can sustain. Secondly, we need to act with a sense of urgency. Right? We are racing the clock against that sea level rise curve. The sooner we get these habitats in place and functioning, the better chance we have that they will be sustainable into the future and persist. And lastly, we need to plan for areas for these baylands to migrate. And so this is a complicated issue, but that can look like a lot of different things. It can mean finding areas where we have open space so we can create those large transition zones. It potentially means artificially creating some large transition zones so that the marshes can migrate upslope, or maybe even rethinking some of our planning efforts around the bay to make sure that we are not putting people in harm's way in the future. But we need to make sure that, with sea level rise coming, that we plan for the migration of these baylands. And so how do we get this done? There has been a lot of personal and professional thought that's gone into a lot of these strategies, but where the rubber meets the road is getting things in the ground. Fortunately, San Francisco Bay has responded yet again. The state legislature developed something called the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority, and they put together a funding package, and the voters overwhelmingly supported it. It was a 9-county parcel tax, passed with over 70% approval. So we have $500 million coming in for these types of projects. So this is a great source of local funding. It can also be used to leverage state and federal grant programs. So we do have a huge commitment that was passed by the voters for investment in these types of projects. And another point I'd like to make is that, and this is often overlooked, is that this investment also means jobs, right? Sometimes the perception of restoration is, school kids planting native plants on the edge of the bay. And while those sort of community-based restoration programs are vitally important for education and getting people to understand the dynamics of the bay, some of these larger scale projects, these are massive construction projects, right? So this is something I'd like to get people thinking about as ecosystems as infrastructure. So when you talk about infrastructure jobs, restoration falls right into that category, in my opinion. These systems provide flood benefits, water quality benefits, habitat benefits, public access benefits, and these are massive construction jobs. And finally, I want to talk about partnerships. It takes a lot of people and a lot of energy to get these projects underway. In the past, perhaps we have all stayed in our corners and fought for our little corner of the bay or our pet projects, but we're running out of time, and partnerships are important. I feel like the private sector, the agencies, academia, those with land use authority, we all need to make sure we're rowing in the same direction. I like to pop this slide up. When I was working on the South Bay Salt Ponds project, this is just a small fraction of the number of entities that were involved in making that one project, a very large project, but a lot of entities are vital to making sure that project gets implemented. And I think this can only be expanded when we start looking at the broader bay. So there are people out there that are working on this, that are thinking about this. If anyone is pondering a project, there are plenty of resources and plenty of people willing to help and start to make connections for these partnerships. Because I think at the end of the day, when we have a thriving and healthy and resilient bay, it benefits all of us. And I think we all want to see this vision achieved, but we are racing the clock. And so I hope that little introduction to the bay and these issues will set the stage for the speakers to follow in these coming webinars. And with that, I'll say thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I noticed a very interesting question in the chat that I was going to reiterate and then see if we some people can chime in on that. The question was, and it's a really good question, is do current flood projections take into account the flood reduction capacity of wetlands? And I would say that's a really hard question to answer yes or no. And I'll let Eileen or others discuss it, because wetlands they can accumulate sediment depending on what rivers feed them, which helps build up the marsh over time. They also can help attenuate the effect of waves and sea level rise. But I don't know if Eileen wants to add a little bit more to that.
While we're waiting for Eileen, I will answer the
Okay.
second question. If the Netherlands successfully address these issues, why haven't we? And their blueprint and expertise are available. I should say that, yes, the Bay agencies have in fact been very closely in touch with engineers at the Netherlands, and they have visited the Bay Area. They have taken a look at it. The situations are considerably different, naturally, and we may not be as the Netherlands started this in, I believe, 1200 AD, starting to live below sea level, and I mean, they have engineered the hell out of it. They are well below sea level. Their rivers, in fact, huge rivers flow through their lowlands and exit into the ocean, which is higher. So, we're not sure we are ready for that particular model, but yes, we definitely are in touch with them. I wouldn't say I am, but I know that ABAG, BCDC, all of these agencies actually have been walking around with coteries of engineers. So yes.
So if I could, and I apologize for not being able to come in earlier. I would like to just give, as far as in the Bay, and what John was talking about in part were the natural adaptations that, which I think we all, and we here in Sierra Club have been trying to encourage, but they're not well known, they're not well understood. It sometimes means asking a community to make some changes to their shoreline that they don't want to make, or city council or whomever that party might be. We have examples of projects in Menlo Park. There is a plan for what they call the safer levee along the shoreline, but that's being brought in combination with the salt pond restoration project, which will build a transitional levees to create new marsh outboard of the safer levee, and thus allowing those adaptations that John was talking about. And we'll be talking about in one of our projects, one of our case studies here will be a place where there's already a marsh, and a levee can be put in and can look at what that combination can do at that location. But this is a big battle for advocates everywhere and looking around the bay. And there are some places that maybe it can be a lot of natural work, and in other cases it's a combination. And but it's a matter of more people knowing about it, understanding it, and talking about it. The more we can maybe get these implemented on the bay. That's what we're doing here.
So there was a comment in the chat also to provide John Bourgeois' contact information. I can do that by email. I don't have it handy with me now. But there was another question. So how has drought affected the wetlands? And I know we've got lower freshwater flows into the bay, and that certainly affects the delta quite a bit. And I don't know if Gita or Eileen want to add anything to that.
Well, just along the bay side, and you're right to mention what's happening, through the delta and those changes in water. But if we have marshland existing, it's really resilient because it's gone through differences of fresh and salt water. And you can see a marsh that is going through a drought year, it is going to have, its vegetation is going to really be all of the salt loving plants. And where if we have a lot of rain in a big winter like that, all of a sudden you're seeing the cattails in the marsh come out. They're all still there. They're just, one grows well in the saltier water, another doesn't. And so they have a resilience. Marshes have a great deal of resilience between what we call saltwater and brackish. And that's a good thing about nature. So as John said, we need sediment to build up their beds, so they're higher in sea level rise, but nature has a great ability to thrive in the right conditions.
Good, thank you, Eileen. So we're going to try to break into breakout rooms now. So really the objective for this breakout room session is just to have a chance for everybody to introduce themselves, to say where they're from, why they signed up for the course. There should be a leader in each group to start you off, but in the event that there isn't for some reason because of technology glitches, please don't wait, but just go ahead, somebody volunteer to be the first. And we've probably got about 15 or 20 minutes. The groups are probably going to be maybe 8-9 people. So let's give this a try. But thank you all for participating. I appreciate that. I think there's, let's see how many people. I think everybody's back.
We missed what you're saying, Chip. We exited the room by accident. Sorry.
Oh, you're in?
We're
back. We're back in the big room.
Yeah,
okay.
We're back in the auditorium. Well, thank you all for participating. I hope everybody got a chance to introduce themselves. I know there was a lot of shuffling of people right at the beginning there. The breakout rooms didn't quite work the way we had planned. We are, so first of all, the return to the main room. There is another video that is really interesting because it gives a historical perspective on San Francisco Bay. And if you are interested, we are going to show some of these 20-minute videos from our webinar. And if you're interested in looking at the slide deck in more detail, because there were some questions that I had about some specific graphics that people saw. You can find the slide decks on our website under the we call it the San Francisco Bay Adaptation webinar, and it was in May of this year of 2021. So if you're interested in that, I will also be sending out a recording to the whole distribution list. If there was parts that you wanted to see again, and that's mostly for people who aren't here tonight that said that they wanted to keep their place in the course. Oh, James wants to know if we should ask any Zoom experts. Why didn't my pre-assigned breakout rooms work if everybody was registered in Zoom? Because what I was trying to do is create a breakout room that had a leader in it so that the leaders could start getting to know individual students. Steve Nina has raised a hand.
Yes, we have. Can you please show people or just let people know that you can turn on the chat function?
Let me wait until this is over. And I'll love to talk to you.
Okay.
So if you could show them how to turn on the chat function at the bottom, so that, because I was just sending things to people individually, and I'm not sure if people saw them or not.
Oh. So you're asking how to work the chat function, or?
No, just let everyone know that if you open up the chat function, then you can keep the chat on the side of the screen, and then you can type in stuff and you can directly interact with each other too. Like I just sent a couple things to Chip, hoping that we can have a further conversation later.
Oh, good. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if you click on the little thought bubble or word bubble, and you can type to everyone, or you can type to individual. So that's good to know. Thank you. And I will put the link to the website video. So that will be in the recording, but I can also share with you the link too in an email after class to everybody. So you can see where it goes. All right. So at this point, we're going to start that other video.
So I next have the honor to introduce Robin Grossinger of the San Francisco Estuary Institute.
Thanks, Virginia, and thanks to the organizers. And it takes a lot of work to organize an event like this. Really appreciate that. I was asked to talk about sort of the big picture of the history and transformation of the Bay, looking through that into the future. So I'm going to look back beyond our familiar bay to before that bay was even here, looking back 10,000 years ago or so, using these neat visualizations by Tanya Atwater. This shows the bay, or the absence of the bay, not that long ago. 10,000 years, not that long in the geologic time frame. And those light green areas that sort of approximate the shape of the bay are actually valley lowlands, grasslands and oak savannas and riparian corridors along the creeks before the sea rised into what we now call the bay. So this is when the last ice age was ending and the glaciers were melting and sea level was rising quite rapidly. And so the bay filled over the past 10,000 years to different intermediate points with various shapes and sizes, until in the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, it started slowing, sea level rise started slowing down to the more, to us, normal rate of 1 millimeter or 2 a year. And it started to approximate the shape that we're familiar with. And the marshes started to build in more and more as sea level rise slowed, to the point where the bay reached what might be sort of a familiar shape, a couple of centuries ago. So we can see that the bay was sort of this shape-shifting, always expanding entity. And the thing is, and realize that the bay has always, at least this bay has always been rising, different rates, and always as the sea level rose consistently, different rates, but consistently over the past 10,000 years, as the sea rose, the bay expanded, its footprint reached out and took over more and more of the valley of the bay. So the next point that I observe, looking at the history of the bay, long-term history of the bay, is that people lived alongside the bay all of that time. indigenous peoples, the native tribes arrived before the formation of the bay. And the bay has always been a source of incredible resources of transportation and navigation, way to get around the region. And so people always lived at the edge of the bay. We don't have maps of that because those areas were submerged, but they undoubtedly lived along the edge of the bay, as evidenced in this map of the distribution of shell mounds a century ago, largely around the edge of the bay. So this brings up a second point to me, which is that the people have always lived at the bay shore, and they had to move inland. Not every year, not every day, but gradually, perhaps episodically, at multiple generations or at the century scale. Inevitably, the bay was getting bigger, and people had to adapt to that. So then a really interesting and anomalous thing happened, which is that if we achieved, because the bay had reached roughly this shape 200, 150, 200 years ago, this would be like a high tide, the full spill, the full extent of the bay that it had reached, then we actually reduced the size of the bay dramatically. So very anomalous, given that the bay had been getting bigger steadily for 10,000 years. Then suddenly, in this brief blip of time, we reduced the size of the bay. So during the past 150 years, the size of the bay decreased by almost a third. Really a remarkable achievement, or anomalous period in time, arguably. And it, of course, narrowed, got smaller at the same time that sea level was still going up, right? But it just was confined into a narrower area. So it was just moving up, but it wasn't moving out. In fact, it was moving in. So we can see that we established that sort of shape of the bay quite a while ago, interestingly, culturally, kind of historically. So this is a photo from around 1940 of Mission Bay after it's already been filled in and highly developed. So this had, by 1940 or 39, whenever this photograph is, the Mission Bay had already been filled for many decades at that point. If we compare that view to a more contemporary view, we see the giant stadium, and we see new freeways, and we see kind of like variation in the wharf pattern, but the shoreline stays remarkably the same. And that's even though the land side changes really dramatically. Like, as I said, the railroads, the highways, many of the buildings, the land use, really dramatically different, but the shoreline almost remarkably exactly the same. Sorry, that may get a little annoying. I never get tired of going back and forth there, but I'll stop now. So great variation on the land side, but this fixed point, this fixed line. Similarly, if we go over here to the other side of the bay and more of a salt pond area at Coyote Hills, you'll see tremendous transformation on the land side, but the line, shore line, staying almost exactly the same. I just did it twice this time. So this construct, this physical and in a way mental construct of the shoreline has seemed remarkably stable, like a permanent feature. For over a century in most places, it's seen as it's all we've known. Those of us who are alive today and our predecessors in the region, it seemed like a fixed shoreline. So we gotten used to these historic features and these sort of long-term features that persisted around the edge of the bay. Now, of course, that's why we're all here. We probably know that period of stability, of seeming permanence, is somewhat coming to an end. If this is a version of the contemporary shoreline, a reduced one. This is a generic future projection of the bay in the absence of barriers, which of course we will slow this down and modify this expansion, but the bay is headed towards, in the long run, getting much bigger. And that's a future view. compared to the historical. Kind of interesting. They're basically almost exactly the same, except for the future is actually going to be even wider than the historical a bit, because the sea has been rising and is rising faster and faster. So the bay is headed towards continuing its trend to getting bigger. And also we have subsided some areas around the edge of the bay, unfortunately. So it's actually lower as well as the sea going higher. So the bay is getting bigger. So the shoreline is going to change once again. It's going to sort of undermine our sense of permanence around the edge. Now, that's caused a really interesting, it's caused this shift in the way we look at the bay. When we made this map of the historical habitats of San Francisco Bay about a little over 20 years ago, we were looking at it particularly for wetland restoration and wildlife habitat and ecosystem, the ecosystem. And so we really were focusing on the brown tidal flats and the green tidal marshes and all the narrow strips of beaches, which you can't really see, and the natural salt ponds and marsh pans. But now it's interesting. I look at this map and I see that still, of course, which has become a major social priority, as Dave mentioned, to restore major elements of that, bring that back. But we also see them as these natural infrastructure that softens the sea level rise, or softens storm surges and waves coming towards the shoreline. And interestingly, if you look closely, you notice that there was nearly a perimeter of nice wetland, mudflat, shallow bay protection, if you will, of the lower lying areas around the bay. And interestingly, the steeper areas like Tiburon or, parts of San Francisco, Marin, Point Richmond, they didn't necessarily have marshes in front of them because they were steep and deep. But they didn't really need it because they were higher and drier. And so the lower areas where you were potentially vulnerable, the low-lying areas were essentially naturally protected by this legacy of mudflats, beaches, and marshes. So now as we come more towards our last few decades, on the positive side, we have really learned how to restore these features. We've really gained a strong skill set and political infrastructure, as Dave showed, of how to do this. We really have gotten quite good at restoring tidal marshes, as this view of the marshes in Napa River, when it really was a tidal channel, or a tidal wetland channel. Napa River and the vast tidal mesh networks and the beaches along the shoreline. We've gotten good at how to restore beaches. So, and we've really demonstrated that with amazing projects, as this project, this sort of new restored marsh shows. So we've gotten quite good at how to restore these features. And we really have actually started moving back in effect, as we have restored areas. We have given more space to the bay. So, and we have this remarkable legacy and opportunity created by previous decades of environmental activism and political, social decisions to protect much of the shallow waters around the bay, not so much in the central bay, but particularly in the South Bay and the North Bay and parts of the Central Bay. We still have that opportunity to use shallow water intertidal habitats as part of our toolkit to protect the edge of the bay. So that's a remarkable achievement and opportunity that we're talking about today. And so we have, I like to think of it looking, from this perspective, a second try, a second chance to reconceive of the shoreline, which we treated in a pretty industrial way, not really valuing the recreation, the public access, the kind of health and nature benefits of a more natural shoreline, as well as the flood protection benefits of nature. So the question is, what will we build this time? What will we do this time? And looking at this sort of retrospective, if you will, two major themes or principles come out to me. One is really the subject of this series, seminar, webinar, which is to design with nature and use the natural infrastructure, take advantage of the natural infrastructure that is available to help modulate the effects of sea level rise. And we've gotten quite good at that, but we need to do much more, and we are working towards that. And then the second principle or challenge or goal in my mind is something we've less figured out how to do, which is to start building more flexibility into the shoreline, start planning for flexibility in the coming decades. And that's probably harder to do, and we haven't really cracked the code on that one, but it could involve things like looking at infrastructure replacement cycles, with wastewater and highways and natural gas pipelines and all the things along the shoreline. Like when we build it next time, what can we do differently to build more flexibility or have less infrastructure in harm's way? It could involve financing mechanisms so that we have the resources, like Measure A, but even more probably, so that when we do have to adapt the shoreline more dramatically, do some big expensive things, we have resource and we haven't just kicked the can down the road, and sort of built that intergenerational equity into the second half of this century when these challenges would be greater. It could also involve building, as we do use these areas along the shoreline, which are probably still usable for several decades or more, building flexibility into those plans so that we sort of know what we're going to do next, the transition to a wetter shoreline, more flexible shoreline. So that's hard to do. And I don't know that we've really done that yet, but we need, hopefully communities around the edge of the bay will start coming up with models so we can start experimenting and building that sort of flexibility that the bay shoreline needs over time. So I like to close, inspire myself or remind myself we can do this with this photograph from the 1930s, which shows us another big infrastructure transition in the bay when we're shifting from railroads and all these terminuses to ferries to get across the bay, to the Bay Bridge, the first Bay Bridge, which of course then 75 years later was replaced by the second Bay Bridge. And so we have in the past had to do this, there is this cyclical transformation of the infrastructure around the edge of the bay, this multi-generational redoing it, and perhaps even better the second or third time, arguably. So I will close there and thank you.
So I didn't see any questions in the chat. We will come back and talk a lot more about nature-based adaptation to sea level rise. One last thing I wanted to kind of end the night with is, what vision do you have for the future of San Francisco Bay? And I don't know, Samantha had, or sorry, that was my hand up on top of you, not your hand. So anybody want to share what their vision is for San Francisco Bay?
Susan, I'm putting a question in the chat that I got while I was presenting.
Oh, okay.
Video that was shared with me by Mike, but just in case anyone has any thoughts on that.
So it says, do you know if the San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate were carved by Ice Age floods?
One of our webinar speakers addressed that, and it definitely was.
Well, I think it may have been a more gradual one than the Missoula floods that formed the Columbia Gorge, which supposedly happened over a really short time scale. But if you, I don't know if anybody's ever been to the Channel Islands off of Santa Barbara, but the west coast of California used to go all the way out there. when sea levels were lower. And some of the first native people to North America actually had civilizations there. And then as sea levels rise, they separated from the mainland. So that was the same time when as sea level rose, the bay filled in, but it was like the video showed, kind of a river valley.
Susan, you might add, for closer to the bay, the Farallon Islands, which sit like 27, 28 miles offshore, once were connected to the bay in land, by a land connection. So that's, probably about the same time as the Channel Islands connections.
So I'm seeing some people sharing in the chat, says otters in the bay. That they were definitely otters in the bay. There's and there's actually now discussion about whether to actively introduce more otters to the bay. And then let's see, and more salmon in the bay, yes. And we've got to protect the rivers where they need to spawn. Restorations of oyster and eelgrass beds. They definitely, we will have a speaker talk about oyster and eelgrass. And one of my colleagues says what her vision for the bay is when it's clean enough to eat out of.
Yeah,
that's
I like that. I like that vision.
Yes, when you can eat oysters out of the bay, which was a huge source of food for the natives and for early settlements here.
And shrimp were here too. But as I say, I'm not very computer savvy, but I remember in 06, there was a bunch of interesting programs about, the 06 earthquake, but there was a video they showed about, the part that always amazed me was, I don't remember all about the Bay Area, but they showed how Cuba was initially in the Pacific Ocean, and there was just a big isthmus there, and then slowly it shifted and the Panama Canal was formed, and that they've actually found Pacific water, seawater in caves in Cuba where there's fish and different kinds of vegetation that existed, millennia ago. I wish I knew how to find it, because it also showed how the Bay Area and Point Reyes were formed, because we have to remember there's a lot of uplifting from all the earthquake activity that happened in the volcanoes. Because that's an attraction of California, it is formed by uplifting of mountains with big valleys and a whole volcanic area on the other side of the Sierras, which is fascinating, especially that video. It showed all of this. And like I said, I don't know how to resource finding that, but I remember it was during the 100 years celebration. I mean, why should we be celebrating the 06 earthquake? But it was so interesting to see. So that is the early formation of the coastline here.
Mm-hmm. And Steve, did you have something you wanted to?
A response to the previous speaker. The author John McPhee, who's written extensively about nature and its impact on our lives, has a wonderful book called Assembling California. And in it, he details what the specific impact of the Pacific plate diving in underneath the continental plate and going and driving the Pacific plate down so deep that the rocks melted. And when the rocks melted all the way up the coast, that's why we have the network of volcanoes that we have. But he has much, much more to add. He wrote for the New Yorker. These were all serialized in the New Yorker over the course of his long career. Assembling California, John McPhee. Wonderful book.
Yeah, I wrote a book, and I read a book about and I'm drawing a blank on the name. Eileen and Gita both know this book, but it talked about San Francisco in the, when it was just being settled. It was called Yerba Buena at the time. And so much of San Francisco has been filled, like the financial district and things like that. And then they talked about ships. They would deliberately sink ships and then just build around them. And so now in San Francisco, you can uncover these ships in the basements of buildings. It's pretty amazing, and all the stuff that came with the ship. But
One thing
that
I
was-
wanted to add, if I may, this is Geeta. The two speakers that we heard from, John Bourgeois and Robin Grosinger, are actually advocates right here amongst us in the Bay Area. And these are advocates who have embedded themselves in agencies. That's another way of being an advocate. And they have worked with us closely on projects, and they're doing great work. So it was really interesting to see them almost with us here in the room. And I just wanted everyone to know that these are not some esoteric people on YouTube. These are people right here with us.
Wow.
And they could have been in the room with us, but we decided, why don't we just use the videos where they put their thoughts together?
Nice.
I would like to respond to some of the people reading the chat room. There's a lot of good thoughts in there about what I want to see in the Bay, and unified governance and less development. But there are several references to oysters, and yes, there are some oyster beds going in. But as you'll be learning more in what we're doing, and one of the natural adaptations for sea level rise is the addition of oyster beds, because oyster beds hold the sediment as we put them in. Not only are they great for the bay and for cleaning the bay, but when you've got them in the soil, they're actually helping to hold it in place and not be washed away. So there's all kinds of aspects to what natural adaptation is, but it is very location dependent.
All right, thank you. Well, I want to thank you all for coming tonight and participating. We've got a great speaker next week. We've got Santa Clara Supervisor Joe Simidian. He's going to be talking about his 13 tips on successful advocacy. So again, we're kind of following along those lines, and then we'll start talking about how do we get involved in the local planning processes. So we'll talk about specific plans and general plans and planning commissions and things like that. So I look forward to next week. Look for an email from me. I will include a recording and links to the two videos tonight.
Wow. Very nice.
So thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Have a
you.
good evening.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very inspiring. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.